it aims to bring practical and science-based information and solutions to dairy farmers and their advisors to support the implementation of best management practices in the areas of animal welfare, animal health, reproduction, and sustainability. If you'd like to know more about the Canadian Dairy Hub, comment Hub in the chat or click in the link that Brooke will be sharing shortly. Now, let's get this discussion started. So I invite our panelists to introduce themselves, and starting with Dave. Dave, if you want to turn on your camera, we'd be happy to hear from you.
Yeah, hey everyone. So my name is Dave Renaud. I'm a veterinarian and epidemiologist at the University of Guelph in the Department of Population Medicine. And I've been there for the past 8 years. I do a combination of research and also veterinary practice as well, with most of my research focusing on calf health and their welfare.
Thank you so much. I would now like to pass it over to Steve. Steve Adam, est-ce que tu pourrais ouvrir ta caméra?
Steve, could you turn on your camera? Yes, hi everybody. I am Steve Adam. I am agrologist and a dairy production consultant in animal comfort and welfare. I have 33 years of experience in dairy production. In the past, I worked 31 years for Lactanet. I did a lot of presentations, trainings. I did a lot of consultations with producers. I collaborated as well in research projects in different universities in Canada. Also, I was one of the members of the committee developing the new version of the Canadian Code of Practice. In the last 2 years, I've been working on my own and on the family farm. So with all of that experience, Steve, thank you for taking time with your busy schedule to help us today. So, and the last but not the least, Andréane Gauthier. Andréane, could you turn on your camera and join us and introduce yourself? Hi, my name is Andréane Gauthier. I am a dairy producer with the Ferme 𝗥𝗲𝗿𝗴 since 2016. I have been co-owner with my partner of the farm. Before that, I was a pharmacist assistant, and I use a lot of what I've learned doing that on my new job at the farm. So thank you very much, Andréane.
We'll move over to a little poll to get all of you on the line. Even if we can't see you, we still want to hear from you as well. So I would invite you, we should be seeing a poll shortly that is coming up because we have a few questions that we'd like to ask you. There you go, it's now coming up. So the first question that we want to ask you is just your general perspective or how you view calf health and welfare on your farm. So you should be able to answer that. There's a few options there. Is it important? And it's something that you dedicate a lot of time and energy. And again, we're not seeing who is answering what. So we do encourage you to be as honest as possible. Is it something that you find important but don't have enough time or resources for? I know that's a reality for many. Something else I think that's gaining in popularity and service providers is it something that you're providing out or contracting out to someone else because you simply don't have the resources or the time to do so? So I'm still seeing a few answers coming in. And if it's not a priority for you, I think that's also a reality. We'd love to, understand why that is and hopefully help you understand the importance of calf health. But I'm assuming if you're joining us today, you do bring some importance to calf health and welfare. So I don't know if you can see the answers as I am as well, but of course, my estimations were good. So I'm seeing 81% of our respondents saying that it is something calf health and welfare that is important to them and that they dedicate a lot of time and energy to. So we're at about 50%, but we do have more questions coming in. I'm just quickly going to share the results, and then we are. Just want to see here. We should be able to. Oh, Excellent. I did not realize that you were getting all of the questions at the same time. My apologies. I don't know, Mo or our AV team, if it's possible to restart it, or otherwise we'll just move on. You should be seeing our answers here. So main calf concerns, that was the part I was most looking forward to getting. The most frequent concern that we have is diarrhea. I think Andréane here will be sharing a little more about that because it's also a challenge that she faced on her farm, as well as respiratory diseases. Other issues that our participants outlined is cross-sucking. And then how often do you assess your calf's health? We have a lot of people who said here every day, 63% of our respondents assess calf health. And that goes to our last question as well of just, I think the way that you're assessing calf health may be different based on your housing and accommodations. So we have 10% of our respondents who are currently housing their calves in individual hutches, and 19% of them in individual outdoor pens. Here we have, and then some people also grouping them indoors, again, indoors as groups. And a few of them are doing a mix of two options. So if you're doing a mix of two options, as we move on in our conversation, I'd love to hear what that mix of two options is. Is it, different housing accommodations for your pre-weaned and post-weaned calves and so on? But we'll move on. So thank you so much for participating in our poll and engaging with us. Donc lançons-nous dans notre première conversation. Oh, un instant.
So let's start with our first conversation of the day with Andréane. Andréane, could you tell us a bit more about your farm, where you are, how many cows you have that are lactating, and all of these details? Yes, so I am in the 𝗬𝗲𝗂 region. We have 85 kilograms of quota, 53 cows that are lactating. I use a tile stall system. With my partner, we put a lot of emphasis on animal comfort. In the last years, there were improvements. Our projects were toward that goal. We want animals that are happy and comfortable so that we get a quality milk. Excellent. And so as we talk about comfortable and healthy cows, that includes how the veals are cows are housed. Yes, we did some renovations around 2017. We used the training from Lactanet and at the time, and I met 𝗖𝗹𝗳 at the time, and we went from one extreme to the other. We had an obsolete system and we changed it. So I have now an individual pen for my new calves or sick cows. I have a pen that is made for calves that are a few days old to 1 month. Everything is adapted, whether it be the height of the bar, the height of the feeders, the hay, everything is adapted. They have a brush with heads that are softer so that they can go scrub themselves. On the other side, it's separated with the place where I go prepare the milk. And on the other side, there's a pen for older calves, and all of the same thing. The brush is adapted, the heights are adapted, and some have toys as well. So you've thought about everything, and despite that, you still have the challenge of diarrhea. So if you can talk to me about this challenge. Yes, after the change, we had a better control on the housing, easier cleaning. All of the small details were added. But despite that, diarrhea was persistent around 7 to 10 days of life. It's a diarrhea that I couldn't associate to transition from powdered milk or other things. So we tried modifications, we talked about it, and despite that, it remained. Some calves had easier times with diarrhea, others not. Sometimes for some I had to reduce milk, others I have to give an anti-inflammatory, but that was the more persistent problem that we had. And at what point did you know that this was a problem and that it wasn't just a normal situation, something that would just stop on its own? Well, in fact, after done a lot of trials, and I concluded that it was maybe something that we couldn't avoid. But when I brought other modifications somewhere else, I understood where the problem was. But I told myself, okay, I've done all that I can, and that's the situation that's going to be. But then a solution was found. So thank you, Andréane. And when talking solutions, we're going to give the mic to Dave, and we're going to come back later to the solutions you found.
So Dave, keeping in mind the challenges that Andréane just shared with us, can you share with our audience what are some of the key cleanliness and biosecurity practices that any farmer and their advisors may want to consider to avoid diarrhea?
Yeah, like in terms of key areas to focus on for biosecurity, I think it really starts in the calving area where you're going to have the calves first exposed to all the different environmental things that could be there. And when we look at pathogens that cause diarrhea, a lot of the pathogens actually are spread by some of the adult cows on the farm. So making sure that we have a clean calving environment, we minimize exposure to manure in particular, because that's where the pathogens typically are, the viruses, bacteria, the things that commonly cause diarrhea is usually in the feces of these adult cattle. So I think really ensuring that we have a clean calving area can go a long way. I think the next important area to focus on is really in the collection of colostrum. When you see some particular pathogens like E. coli, for example, which usually causes diarrhea very early on in life, a lot of it can be traced back to the cleanliness of the colostrum being fed to the calves. So making sure that we have clean colostrum, doesn't have high levels of bacteria, is really important to help to protect against diarrhea, and also helps to improve the immunity that's passed through the colostrum as well. The next consideration, kind of moving sequentially through the calf's life, is to make sure that the housing environment we're putting calves into is also clean. So if you have calves with diarrhea, for example, they're going to shed a ton of the pathogen into the environment. So the coronavirus, rotavirus, 𝗧 will get shed into the environment in very high levels. And if you simply put another susceptible young calf into that housing environment where it's not clean, so we haven't removed the manure, we haven't pressure washed or disinfected the housing environment, that can definitely be a major risk factor for spreading the pathogens. So making sure we have a clean, well-sanitized environment that we're putting calves into after they're born is also really important. The other area, the final consideration to have as well, is with regard to the sanitation of the feeding equipment that we're using to feed calves. So making sure that the milk bottles, the automated calf feeding lines are clean, free of bacteria, has been shown to have a pretty big impact on reducing diarrhea. So I think in kind of order of the calf's life, making sure that we have a clean calving area, making sure our colostrum doesn't have high levels of bacteria in it when we're feeding to calves. We put the calves into a clean and well-sanitized environment for them to live, and also making sure that the milk feeding equipment that we're using to give that calf the nutrition that it needs is also clean, are probably the key considerations for biosecurity on the farm.
Thank you so much, Dave. That was an answer packed with practical and tactical information that I hope farmers can just be reminded of or apply on their farm. Donc, Dave va parler un petit peu de la propreté de l'environnement. Donc, restant dans ce
Steve is going to talk again about the cleanliness cleanliness of the environment. In terms of the stalls, how do you make sure that we can optimize the health and prevent diarrhea in the environment? Yes, so there are basic rules to respect in terms of housing. First, if we look at diarrhea and Andréane's problems, we need materials, everything that is in the environment, the fences, all of those materials need to be easily washed and disinfected. Plastic is the best material for that, easiest to clean. Also, in the design, sometimes we see stalls that are not adapted, made to be easily cleaned. So the floor has to be easily washed. How easy is it also to clean the calves on a daily basis? It's a manual work, but sometimes when we have other things to do, we figured about doing that one day. That's not good. So the work needs to be easy. So there's there needs to be materials adapted to bigger calves as well. Calf management as well, in terms of diarrhea and pathogen transmission. We have to deal with the situation as we were dealing with individual calves. Even if we house them in groups, we have to be able to separate the calves to do that, and that needs we need good ventilation, and often that is the problem, is the air. Even if we've got good air circulation, air doesn't make it to the floor height, because calves are low to the ground most of the day, so we need the air to go low to the ground as well. Yes, okay. Thank you. Sorry. Here I've got some slides. Yes, here is an example. I took this photo because it showed everything. So we have here, the walls are plastic, the floor slope goes towards the left. So if we clean, the water goes to the gutter that is there for cleaning. It's easy as well. There's a hole here, so when we clean, we can send the manure and the excrements to the hold. And in this environment as well, we've got hot water, a hot water sink to wash the instruments. And you can see all of the fences, all of the stalls, everything is washable. Water can get onto that, and we can disinfect. So that is a great example. So thank you, Steve, for that. It makes things very concrete for us. So when we talk about calf environment, they're in a really nice pen, but we also have to look at our feeding practices. Can you talk to us about your main rules for feeding calves? Well, as Dave said earlier, it's a question of hygiene. That's number one. Everything needs to be cleaned and disinfected well. And for milk consumption, you need to have bottles or buckets that have teats, so that the calves can use its normal behavior. We talk about bucket hygienes, but also milk utensils. Everything has to be cleaned. Also, Andréane was mentioning the height of the buckets, the teats. For Holstein cows, the height must be about at the same height of the mother's udder, and that gives the calf a better angle, more natural angle to feed on. If you're using powdered milk, if you have to mix it manually, don't go with volume, but you have to take a certain quantity of a powder, and you have to have the same content every time. The milk has to be at the same temperature as well, always. When you mix the powder, you have to have water that's hot enough to dissolve the fat, but you have to bring the milk back to 38 degrees body temperature. The other rules, I would say, it's about quantities. I think a minimum 20% of the calf weight. That's what we ask for. So if you do more than 3 liters, you can go to 3 meals a day. That's going to help with digestion. Andréane mentioned as well the transition from a whole milk to a powdered milk that could create stress. So that transition is important. And the last thing is often for diarrhea. Some people will use cow's milk that is not disposed, but it cannot be used for human consumption. But sometimes that milk has a variable composition from one day to the other, and that can make a difference to the calf. So we don't advise that the calves receive that milk. So thank you, Steve. I'm hoping that you're taking notes at home, because there's a lot of important information here. And same thing with Adrienne when she comes back to talk to us.
Thank all 3 of you for this great start to our conversation. I think Andréane also has a few questions for Dave, so I'd like to pass it over to her to ask those questions to Dave.
Oui, Dave, quelle est la meilleure pratique pour nettoyer
Yes, Dave, what is the
matériel
best
d'alimentation?
practice to clean the feeding material?
So the best practice to make sure we have clean feeding equipment is really comes down to kind of the process that we're using. So the typical recommendation is when you're cleaning feeding equipment is to make sure that you do an initial warm water rinse. Because if you go with water that's too hot, what often happens is the milk proteins on the milk that we feed to calves coagulates over the surface of the plastic and actually can stick on there for long periods of time. So it's really important to do a warm water rinse, get all those proteins out of the bottle or whatever feeding equipment you're using, and then follow up with a hot water scrub with soap. And then the other important thing is to make sure that you're letting it dry. If you follow those kind of key steps, you should have very little levels or low levels of bacteria in your feeding equipment.
Bien. Puis, quel conseil auriez-vous pour
And
gérer
what
les maladies
advice
dans
would
les
you
écoles
have for managing disease
So the key
in
thing
group
with group
housing?
is to make sure that you keep the group small. So in the research that's been done in this area, most of the research is pointing to keeping groups of calves less than 10. And if you can keep groups of calves that are less than 10, that will lower the risk of disease. Other studies that have been done with larger groups, so more than 10, have shown that they have higher levels of respiratory disease. And probably that's related to just more pathogens being in the environment, but perhaps related to other things like stocking density, ventilation not being quite right. So when you set up groups for success, it's really important to have them be less than 10 animals per group. The other thing to consider too is that, especially with the smaller farms that we have here in Canada, it's also important to not have a big age gap between the animals in the group. So probably having an age gap of maybe 2 weeks to maybe a month maximum is probably appropriate, because some of the older animals will actually shed pathogens back to younger calves. So those are some of the key considerations. The final consideration with group housing is also that because we're feeding them as a group, we're not monitoring or not as able to monitor individual intake of milk. It's also important that we evaluate the calves more frequently for signs of disease and also try to use some of the data we can generate from automated calf feeders or the drinking that the calves are doing in general to hopefully identify disease sooner. Because often in group housing, because we have more animals in there, it's important that we identify disease sooner. So maybe we can isolate some of those sick calves or at least treat them sooner before they become more severely ill.
Thank you so much, Dave, for helping us answer Andréane's questions. And I'm sure those are also questions that farmers on the call have for us. So now, speaking of our audience, we want to engage with you again. So our AV team should be putting up a second poll. And now that I know that all the questions come up at once, I will give you a little more time to answer them. And I won't close the poll early. So our first question that we want to ask you and hear from you is regarding technologies or tools that you may be using and have found to be helpful to manage calf health and welfare. So we know that there's a lot of options out there. So we've listed a few. I think you can only select one, but if you feel like there's anything else that's not in there, we also invite you to comment it in the chat. But the options that we have listed include automated feeding systems, environment control systems. So Steve talked earlier about the importance of ventilation. There's a lot of health scoring apps. If it's not an app, are you even just keeping it in a note on your phone or in a paper in your office? And of course, there's herd management software programs that exist to meet your needs. So as I previously mentioned, if the tools and technologies that you use are not listed there, or if you use more than one, we invite you to also comment that in the chat. Our second question for you is, how do you primarily like to learn about new calf health and welfare practices? So of course, today we're offering you a webinar and we hope that you appreciate the mix of practical experiences from Andréane, but also the expertise of Steve and Dave. But the other options that we've put there are advisors' advice, in-person seminars or workshops, online digital resources and webinars, print resources, peer recommendations, or others. And again, we're asking that question because we want to make sure that we are answering your questions properly and that we keep bringing you the content where and how you want it. And the last poll question that we have for you is, what improvements have you made for calf health and welfare in the past year, if you have done any? So was it improving housing design or management? Did you make small or bigger changes to your feeding practices? Or instead, did you focus on monitoring, data collection, and tracking? Again, if there's any of those options that you're currently applying that you feel are not represented in the options, we invite you to comment them in the poll. And it's also okay to not have made any changes and to just keep your system status quo, identify what works, and aim to go from there. So I see that we have about 42% of our participants who have now answered. So I'll go have a look at the answers. So in terms of technologies here, I'd say a quarter of our respondents use automated feeding systems. So quite interesting. I know that these have certainly gained in popularity over the last few years. And I'm sure Dave and Steve could talk even more about specific challenges that come with those. We have obviously environment control systems, so happy to see that 20% of our respondents use that. Then 18% of our participants who responded to the poll use herd management software programs. So just quickly moving to the second question, how do you like to learn about new calf health and welfare practices? 40% love to hear about their love to consult their advisors. So we're lucky to have great veterinarians, nutritionists, independent consultants, agronomists. So keep chatting with them, and hopefully we continue supporting them as well. We have a 28%, almost a third of our respondents who like going online, finding digital resources, webinars. So happy that you found us today. And then to our last questions about improvements that you may have made in the last year. Again, we have an even split between improving housing design management, improved feeding practices, and improved monitoring, data collection, and tracking. So again, for those of you who may want to share about your experiences, the chat is there, and we invite you to connect amongst yourselves if you may have questions regarding those. So I'll stop sharing for now to be mindful of our time, and I'll just get back to our discussion. Donc, Andréane, de retour.
Andréane, we're back to you. In the first discussion before the webinar, when we met, you told me that there were some key sectors that you were focused on to avoid diarrhea and to improve the immune status of your animals. Can you share some of these things that you do as you manage your calves as of their birth? Yeah, absolutely. So earlier we were talking about the environment. So what I do is that when the calf is born, I give them time with the cow so that they can, go through that moment and free up their hormones. I've got a nasal vaccine. That's my first protocol. I introduced that, and I've started to do that in the past few years. And I start to give first defense. I had stopped thinking everything was fine, but I underestimated, the power of that, and it's to protect the calf. So when I started using this habit again, one of the, it seems like a weird detail, but I was noticing that the capsule, on the farm, like there were some, traces of use and that sort of thing. And my thought was, it seems like that's a place where bacteria can stay, even if I wash them and that sort of thing. So I bought new ones. And that's, it makes a difference, as it turns out. So disinfecting the belly button as well. I'm teaching nobody anything there. What I learned recently is that, putting iodine directly on the belly button is that there are some issues, and there had been research done, observations, we'll say, that were made, saying that it could be a little too strong, and so it's not good. So what I'm going to do is I dilute the iodine, and I'll use like a little container to soak the belly button, and I won't do it just once. I'll do it, because they're babies, right? They're just born, and so I always leave my bottle close by, and I just sort of clean the belly button more than once, sort of repeatedly, regularly. Obviously, colostrum is so good with natural antibodies. And at the time, we used the retractometer. We wanted to measure all of the antibodies. And so what I've done for a long time, on a daily basis, let's be honest, I don't test every single cow at each birth, but I know that my cows have a good level. My cows have a good level of antibodies. If I've got a doubt, I will test them. But essentially, I do trust that I've got quality colostrum. I give colostrum through a bottle with a nipple on the end, and the cow's there, and I make sure that everything is done in the 2 hours since birth. That way the calf is awake and active. And if I'm not on the farm personally, then I've got cameras. I can keep an eye on my birthing cow. After that, well, they'll take transition milk, and within 3 to 4 days, I'll transition to powdered milk. And what helps after that, and I didn't make this up myself, I didn't invent this, but I realized it was good when we started to use sex semen for better cattle and Angus breeds. it meant that there were fewer calves at the same time because Angus was on the farm for a week at a time. So I ended up getting calves over a long period of time, so I wasn't overcharged, and that was helpful. So basically, yes, we keep, you know, all of the pens clean and dry. We go through them a lot and clean them a lot. But if we've got, you know, 10 calves versus 3 calves, it's way easier to manage 3 calves. And I always keep them in a duo at the base, right? They're always together so that they're motivated and together. Because, you know, it's cow nature to not be alone. Yeah, so you've been influenced by your work at the hospital, and I think you also do things every 3 days. What else do you do? Yeah, so we'll come back to the moment where the calf will come out. I give them a dose of selenium, and then I'll weigh them and measure them. That's in the file. And I put all the information, the data into my file, and then I take a picture for my recording. I will give them their little toy and they'll start in the pen with that. Okay. So your calves are well treated, huh? And as for the little toy, I mean, animal welfare is a sector that's a priority for you, I believe you've said on a few occasions. So can you give us an example of things that you do to ensure cow comfort and calf comfort specifically? Yeah, so you want good bedding. We work with straw. We put a lot of straw, especially in the wintertime. We put even more straw in the wintertime. And then there are covers, obviously. When we started to use the covers, I adopted this process. At one point, I have to admit that I wasn't sure at the beginning because you know, the cover works well when there's good management. You can't just leave the cover with your calf and go by 3 weeks later, right? The cover needs to be clean, and you don't want your calf to get too hot. And, you know, you want to check the weather, right? You know, like now the weather's up and down, whereas in the summertime, we don't pull out the covers. Obviously, it's a question of logic. And so they've got their comfort, they've got a toy and accessible food, you know, hay. Okay, that's really interesting. I was going to ask the question, but then you gave the answer already. Let's talk about food. What's your feeding strategy for your calves? Okay, so milk is the most important food. First of all, we weigh the powder. We weigh it. Because we were sort of told what Steve mentioned. If you just take a cup, the variation could play, and that could have an impact on the animal. And so we weigh the powder. For a long time, my spouse had a hot water tank that was always at the right temperature. That's what we did at the time. And so we have hot water for me, hot water for him, and we can use it. And we, you know, before we had the hot water for him, hot water for me, and we now have the same hot water. It's always in the same quantities, always at the same temperature. And I use a cement mixer with the drill here, like you see in the picture. And so there are no lumps. Everything is mixed properly. Yeah, what do we see here? Let me just look at the pictures here for a second. Okay, so the first pen, the one on your right, that's where they start. I mean, you see, it's very simple. These are all things that have been built by my spouse. He's very capable of building these things. And we always try to do projects, you know, sort of max comfort, minimum cost is our goal. Right, okay. And if we talk about the work that we can do you have details on this solution here? I'm kind of breaking the conclusion here, but you had a diarrhea problem. What was the solution that you found? What did you end up doing And how did it have an impact on calf performance? Well, this is funny because we kind of like hit the solution without knowing it at first, because when we had the idea of, trying to design the space that we had, because that's the other challenge, right? I didn't have a whole lot of space. So we have to work with what we have. I wanted calving spaces. I wanted to maximize my nursery and create adequate calf pens. So I started to do research and I asked questions. I talked to Steve, I talked to Lactanet, I talked to the regional vet, and I took all that information from everybody and I thought, okay, why don't we make a calving space, but leave the calf with the cow, kind of like when we're at the hospital and our baby goes into a transparent box, right? Because we want to see the baby, we want the baby to be close, but we also don't want to roll over them while we're sleeping. So it's the same principle. So the space that I had to create these pens was minimum. So I couldn't, I didn't want to have to manage the calf too close to the manure or whatever, right? So what we did is my spouse had the idea of putting this in a grid, and we have a grid that's open so it doesn't get moist or humid, and the calf is close to the cow, and that's basically what we see in the picture. In the picture, they have heated lamps to keep the heat, right? So they don't shiver. We made these railings robust just to make sure that they didn't break. We didn't want to have any possible risk. So we created like a very safe structure here, all soldered and solid. And so the calf is inside and the cow will stay next to her calf to lick her and stimulate, or to lick it and stimulate it. And the food is also there as well, right? So the food is there. They can eat the silage. The cow can eat the silage and can see the calf. And we put a lot of straw because it was directly on cement. We put a thick carpet down to avoid any slippage. And essentially, we realized that this went above our expectations. This way the cow experiences calving as naturally as possible, and they can manage the hormones. And I don't have any placenta retention, or hardly ever. And the calf is hugely stimulated because they're going to be there. The calf is going to be there with the cow until the milk will be ready to go to the veau tanks, to the calf tanks. So for 3-4 days, right? But up to then, they are side by side. So when I put the milk into the petri, the calf or the cow is hungry, she'll lick, or she's happy as well, and she licks the calf, and then the colostrum's there, the transition milk is there. And so essentially the diarrhea eventually goes away because the calf is absorbing more antibodies. Okay. My computer is having issues, but my last question for you, Andréane, in the next 30 seconds, if I may, to see, okay, this is improving health, the health of the calf. What numbers are you using to assess the improvements? Right, so at 3 days, when I do the weight and the measurements, I'll do the same exercise at the time of weaning. So if my calf hasn't doubled its weight, I'll keep it inside longer to stimulate it, at least with feed or hay, and then we'll work on weaning. If the weight of the calf has doubled, everything's going well, we will allow the growth to continue. And during that growth, then, when we've weighed the growth, then we'll look at the vaccines and all the follow-up, weigh them again, and continue with the follow-up. Okay, thank you. It's great to hear that you're taking the time to do that. We know this is not easy. We don't always want to do it either, but we need to take the time and ask for assistance if needed. I know that you had an employee that helped you, but I guess that's the other thing, is that when people can't get it all done, they need to ask for help. And we, need to ask around and see who can help. So thank you very much. Let's move on to the questions for advisors. But before that, I would like to just ask. This is where I'm supposed to switch to English.
Dear participants, I invite you, if you also measure or track the success and growth of your calves, to comment it in the chat. Maybe there's other things we haven't thought of beyond weighing the calves, or if you weigh your calves yourselves, we'd also love to hear it. So now moving on to Steve for another question, because Andréane briefly touched on it, the cuddle box or la boîte à câlins. What is that? And what is your experience with it?
Oui, la boîte à
The
câlins,
cuddle box.
présentement,
Yeah.
c'est
So
fréquent, mais on commence à voir, je pense, c'est une bonne alternative entre,
not everybody's using it, but it's a good
d'avoir
alternative
les veaux avec la mère,
between having the calf with the mom all the
ou,
time from the get-go
ou
or
l'avoir
not,
séparément avec la mère.
where
Ce que
the
ça
calf
permet de
is
faire,
separate.
c'est que la vache a accès à son veau, ça le permet de le sécher comme il
So
faut, de stimuler.
the cow can stimulate and dry her calf because she has
Ici,
access to it.
les gens qui en ont installé, des fois, ils
And
combinent ça
people
dans
who
leur
have
révélage avec
set up
une
these cuddle
barrière
boxes, they
pour
put them
pouvoir
in the
contrôler la
calving
position
area
de la vache.
with a barrier, and
Puis les commentaires
the
que
cow and the calf can
souvent
be
les
side by side.
premières lactations sont beaucoup plus faciles à
And
prendre
often
parce que la
first
vache a accès
lactations
à
are
son veau.
easier
Moins,
to do
c'est
because the cow has access
une
to the
des
calf and doesn't move
avantages
around as
aussi,
much.
c'est que
Another
le veau,
advantage
ça
is
permet de retirer
that
l'eau des excréments de
it
la
means
mère
that you can
de temps en
take
temps quand
the
en fait, c'est une
calf
forme de
away
transmission
from mom's excrement
de
if
colis
needed.
de
And
pathogènes
so then you
et de
avoid
virus aussi.
pathogen and E. coli spreading.
La procédure, souvent, je me fais
As for the
demander combien de temps
procedure,
qu'on laisse
often I'm
avec
wondered,
la
or I'm
mère.
asked, how
Je
long
pense que
do we leave
c'est
the
libre à
calf with
chacun.
mom?
Ça peut passer
It's kind of a decision.
quelques
It's a
heures,
personal
une
one.
journée
It
à
could
3
be a
jours,
couple of
puis
hours, one
après,
day,
puis
to
on en
3
laisse un peu
days.
plus longtemps.
And in some cases, it
C'est
can be
juste
a
de
little
s'assurer,
bit
par exemple,
longer.
que
What
quand
you
on
do
va
want
laisser
to
longtemps
ensure,
le
though,
veau
is
dans
that,
la boîte,
the longer the calf is in the
qu'il doit avoir
box,
un espace assez grand
well, you
pour
want to
gérer
make sure that you
les
have a
excès
big
de veau.
enough
Il faut pas qu'il y ait à
space
coucher dans le
and
corps des excès.
that
Donc,
you
l'hygiène
give
aussi
the
est
calf
aussi à
a
prendre en
space to lie
considération.
down where it's not lying in its urine and its excrement. Thank you, Steve.
Leads up nicely to my next question for Dave, who's been a little quiet for the last few minutes, but I have not forgotten about you. So Dave, what's your advice for farmers who may also be interested to implement a cuddle box on their farm from a calf health standpoint?
Yeah, it's definitely a very interesting concept, and one that I hadn't seen before we saw the pictures that were put up here. I think the key with a lot of these things is really to make sure that you don't have contact from the adult cow to the calf in terms of manure contact. I think that's really, really important, not only for the calf diseases that we talked about before with regard to diarrhea, but also for things like Johne's disease, for example, or for Salmonella Dublin. It's really important that we try to minimize manure contact between the adult cow and the calf. So from the pictures that were presented, it seems like this works really well, and in the system that Adrian's made. And yeah, those would be the kind of key considerations that I would think about.
Thank you so much, Dave. So I'm already seeing the time and we're right on time, but we are coming to a close shortly in the next 20 minutes. So I just want to give a last opportunity for 3 guests today to answer a few round robin questions, if you will. So really quickly, I'll start off with Steve. But Steve, you know Andréane from before. What really stood out or still stands out to you regarding her management on the farm?
Ça fait quelques années que j'ai rencontré Andréane, puis on s'est
So
contacté quelques
I met her a
fois
few years
après,
ago, and then we got in
on
touch a
l'avait
bit
vu sur les
after.
photos.
But
Au
as you've
départ,
seen in the
c'est
pictures,
pas des bâtiments neufs, donc ils essayaient
she doesn't
de faire
have
le
new
mieux
buildings,
possible
so
avec
they
les
really
bâtiments
tried
qu'il y
to
avait.
do the best that they
Puis
could with the buildings
son,
that they had.
ce qui est surprenant dans
And
toute leur gestion,
what's
c'est qu'ils sont
surprising
super
in
soucieux
all of
des
that
détails,
is that they have a really good
attention,
eye
puis ils
on
prennent beaucoup
detail.
d'informations de
and they pay attention to things, and they get a lot of outside information that they then apply to the farm. And I think that's a huge plus in terms of their management. They are attentive to the minutest details. Yeah, I think we've heard that actually. We don't know. I don't know Andréane for. I haven't known her for a while, but Andréane, we're talking about you. So my next question is for you: what are the main recommendations that you would have for other producers or people who have similar situations to yours? What suggestions would you make? Well, the first thing that I could do is say that it doesn't have to cost a lot of money for it to work. And as you mentioned, I mean, these are questions, right? Like you want to talk to people. I've asked a lot of questions. I've done research. I've done trial and error. And, that's kind of how I function across the board. I ask questions and I see how I can improve. So don't look at it as this like financial mountain. A nursery doesn't have to be that. You don't want to like balk at the amounts. Just take ideas and then adjust according to the space, according to where you're situated. And we're lucky because we've got extraordinary people with us, Lactanet, all the resources that we could possibly need. So ask questions. You can't be any more annoying than me. I promise you that. Yeah, we're not paying Andréane to talk about Lactanet just to say, she's gotten support. So Andréane, thank you for sharing what you're saying and sharing your creativity and your open-mindedness. I'm sure you will have already inspired some people. I got a couple of other questions for you. If you had to start again, Andréane, what exactly would you do? Is there something that you would do differently? No. If I had to start again, I would do things the same way. I'm so proud of the results. This said, had I had a bigger budget, or eventually for the future, I still have some wood in my barn. It would be easier to have something that was more easily washable. So that would be the big change. Okay, last question for you. Promise. What are the best practices that you have in mind that you would like to put in place in the next few years? Okay, so ventilation, aeration. I don't have an ammonia surplus, but it's not solved yet. So I know that ventilation is something that I really need to focus on. And it's not negligible. So that's what's coming along. At the same time as I continue everything else. Yeah, great. So it'll be 2 for 1 at that point. Magnificent. So Dave, for those folks struggling with calf diarrhea,
in addition to, of course, talking to advisors, which is one of the main ways that our poll indicated our audience like to get new information, are there resources or tools that are available that can help? And if so, where can they be found, of course, beyond the Canadian Dairy Hub?
Yeah, I think there's the first thing to talk to, or first person to talk to, is probably their veterinarian. So it's really good to hear that a lot of the participants in this webinar are doing that already. We have some resources available in Ontario or through calfcare.ca, which is led by Veal Farmers of Ontario, who do a really excellent job, I think, summarizing some of the available evidence. And I think Brooke just threw it in the chat there for people to check out.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Dave. Steve, est-ce que tu aurais des petits commentaires finaux, des choses que j'ai oublié de te poser?
Steve, any last comments before we move on to and take questions from the public? No, general comments, no. It's as soon as we have a problem with calves, you want to follow the chain from calving to weaning. What are those steps? Is there anything that you can improve? How can we move forward methodically? Like Andréane says, you take a step back and you analyze the situation and then you improve things. But don't panic, right? I think people do that already on most farms. Great, thank you, Steve.
In the registration form that everyone filled out, we had a few questions for you, and we wanted to identify what questions were of most interest to you. So I'll be starting off with one. Dave, you can start answering, but Steve, also feel free to jump in as you see fit. So my question for you is, what are the top 5 feeding and nutrition recommendations? Of course, we shared a lot of information today, but if we can only remember 5 at the end of this webinar, what would they be?
Yeah, so I think for me, the top 5 would be starting with colostrum. I think although a lot of producers, I think, are tired of hearing about colostrum, it really is the most important thing that we can do to calves. If we can get enough colostrum into the calf right away at birth, it's really going to have a substantial impact on their ability to fight off disease and also their ability to grow and develop as a calf. So that is my absolute number 1. I think there's also some recent data showing that feeding transition milk or feeding colostrum, small amounts of colostrum or colostrum replacer daily for up to the first 14 days of the calf's life, in addition to their colostrum feeding, can also be beneficial in reducing disease, specifically diarrhea, and also has been shown in some cases to improve growth. So that might be another one to consider. For a third recommendation, I think it's important that we feed higher planes of nutrition. So in this case, making sure that we're feeding more than 20% or 20% or more of milk per day to ensure that we're getting not only having the immune system enough nutrients for it to fight off disease, but also making sure that we're achieving our targets. I know there's a lot of questions in the chat in terms of what's a good target to achieve, but probably anywhere between 850 grams to a kilogram of body weight gain per day is probably appropriate. And you can do that with feeding high planes of milk nutrition. Other considerations include maybe avoiding waste milk. I know Steve talked a little bit about that before, but waste milk has antibiotics in it. It has variable levels of fat and protein in it as well, which really can compromise growth and also increase the likelihood that a calf develops diarrhea. So those are probably my top answers for that.
Thank you so much, Dave, for sharing. Steve, quelque chose d'autre que tu aimerais ajouter avant qu'on passe à la prochaine question?
Steve, anything else to add before the next question? No, I think that was pretty complete, besides hygiene and weaning techniques over 10 days. If you do that over 10 days. And for concentrate, forage consumption, have enough water around. Often we forget about that, but it's very beneficial. Right, so you talked about the longer weaning period, and I think it connects with another question that one of our participants has asked. How do we reduce the risks of non-nutritional cross-sucking? How do we reduce? Oh, I don't know if that's Dave or me, but I guess I can take this one and Dave can fill in. But from the get-go, you know, you have to be able to fill the need for the calf to want to suck. So with a nipple where the orifice isn't worn, so you know it takes a while before the calf satisfies that desire, and so sometimes they'll finish and they'll go and suck at anything that moves or doesn't move, and then at one point, when it comes to eating solid foods, so having foods, you know, often when they continue to want to suck, it's because calves are hungry or they're stressed, and so they want to, you know, try to eat by sucking. So those are just a couple of things. And earlier we saw that there were things that could we could add to the environment to distract them in, you know, brushes or balls on the ground. You know, balls on the ground are maybe not super great because sometimes the balls get dirty and then the calves lick the ball, and then, you know, it could promote bacteria.
Dave, anything else you'd like to add to Steve's answer regarding reducing risks of cross-sucking when we're housing calves together?
Yeah, I was late flipping over the translation, so hopefully I got most of Steve's answer, but I think his answer is very complete. I think maybe the only other consideration is when you're feeding milk, especially with a nipple bottle, probably leaving it out for a period of time, I think up to 10 to 30 minutes after they're finished drinking the milk, can also help to direct their focus and attention towards suckling on the nipple bottle rather than suckling on their neighbors. So that's one other thing that I've seen work out in the field.
Thank you so much, Dave. Andréane, j'avais dit que j'avais plus de questions pour toi, mais j'en ai une petite dernière. Donc, tu as parlé des
Andréane, I said I didn't have a question for you remaining. I have one more. Do you have problems sometimes when you move the calf 3 days after weaning? Yes, that was my after calving, I'm sorry. Yes, I think that according to me, it is easier to separate after 3 days than only a few hours after. When I separate the calf, I have the cow going on one side to go to its stall for lactation, and the calf that goes the other way to its pen, its individual pen before he goes to group housing. I didn't have any big reactions from calves because they have time with the cows. The reaction is not as big. If you only give them 30 minutes together, then they're missing out on some things that they have to live together. So I have not had problems. Yes, so I'm happy to hear that because sometimes it's some concerns that we have with that new way.
So for those, well, for the farmers who are still housing in older barns, I think like Andréane alluded to, right, with wooden walls, what's the best way to clean those wooden walls or those pens between calves and groups, especially in the winter, when we know whether it's not possible or it's really not an option to keep those pens clean?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. I was maybe jumping the gun and answering some questions in the chat before I should have, but yeah, I think for this one, it's really difficult. I think when you're dealing with wooden walls, like they're pretty good at harboring cryptosporidium in particular in the little nooks and crannies within the wood itself. So it can be quite challenging to clean just in general. But especially in the wintertime, if you can't pressure wash because of humidity buildup, because of freezing and all that stuff, probably the most important thing is to make sure that you're cleaning out the manure frequently, especially between calves if you can. And then just adding in new bedding. I think that is probably a simple solution perhaps to that question, especially if you're not able to pressure wash. Because if you're not able to pressure wash and you can't remove all the manure or organic material off the wall, a lot of the disinfectants that we use really aren't good enough to kind of break through that manure or that organic material on the walls. So that would be my suggestion.
Thank you so much. We also have a question from Karen, and the question is regarding the protocol for cleaning nipples. Is it the same, or what are different considerations when cleaning like bottle nipples compared to pails or bottles? And I don't know if Steve or Dave, you want to start off with that. Dave, I don't know. I'd
Sure.
like to, yeah, go to you.
I'm happy to jump in.
We're in the English mindset.
Sure. So I think it pretty much is the same principle. So try to rinse it with warm water initially, try to put it in hot water and scrub it with soap and then let it dry. I think if you do that with all your feeding equipment, it should work relatively well in terms of reducing the levels of bacteria. So that would be my suggestion. I don't know, Steve, if you have other suggestions as well.
Non, c'est pas mal, c'est la méthode standard.
No, that's pretty much the standard method.
La désinfection
Disinfection,
devrait fonctionner.
normal disinfection, that should work. So thank you very much.
I want to thank all three of you, our panelists, Dave Renaud, Steve Adna, and Andréane Gauthier, for being here with us today. I do join you on the line to thank them as well, whether it be in the chat or using the React or emotion function. Les trois panélistes d'aujourd'hui nous ont bien démontré qu'une gestion des veaux en groupe.
So the three panelists showed us that a group or individual management of calf is possible. Sometimes we have to be creative or change our management method.
So I want to thank you again our participants for attending the Canadian Dairy Hub webinar, which is brought to you by Lactanet and made possible thanks
arrête
to
avant le temps.
someone. Yeah, that's
Ça
okay.
finissait à...
Mo, can you just keep the audience muted? Thank you so much. So I just want to thank everyone, and I invite you to, again, visit the Canadian Dairy Hub, our webpage, join our mailing list, and follow us on socials. Again, as I was saying, the Canadian Dairy Hub is brought to you by Lactanet and is made possible thanks to DFC funding through the National Knowledge Transfer Structure in Dairy Production Project. We would also appreciate if you could take 2 minutes to fill out this satisfaction survey. We value your input. We want to improve for our next webinars coming in the winter of 2025. And while we wait for your responses, so we do invite you either to take your phone, scan the QR code, or if you're already on your phone, I think Brooke should also be putting the link in the chat, and we'll also be sharing that with you in our follow-up email. So again, while we wait for your responses, we also just want to share with you that the draw for the gift will proceed to the draw in the coming days, and we'll also be sharing the winner of that draw in our email. So be sure to check your inboxes. With that, we wish you a great afternoon. Thank you again for being with us. Merci encore une fois à nos panélistes et merci à vous tous d'avoir été avec nous pour aujourd'hui.
So thank you once again to our panelists and to everybody that was here with us today.